"You're trespassing on HOA property, cowboy." The voice cracked through the static of the walkie-talkie like a sheriff in a bad western, except the woman shouting it wore yoga pants and a rhinestone visor, not a badge. I stared at her from across the new iron fence that, just yesterday, didn't exist. Behind me, my cows stood confused, mooing at the unfamiliar barrier that sliced right through the grazing pasture. One of them even tried to nose the gate open, and got zapped by an electric line I hadn't installed. It was 8:12 a.m., I still hadn't had coffee, and apparently, the neighborhood had decided to secede from common sense while I was asleep. The kicker? I never signed up for an HOA. Didn't even live in a neighborhood. My name's Wyatt Collins, and I own 86 acres of prime Texas ranchland that's been in my family longer than color TV. And this HOA, apparently run by a group of over-caffeinated suburbanites led by a woman named Karen, yes, really, decided overnight that my land felt like part of the community. So they took it. I had just come back from a 3-day fishing trip with zero cell service, only to find that someone had installed a fence along my driveway, fenced off my front field, and posted a laminated sign on my barn that read, "Welcome to Whispering Creek HOA. Guidelines enforced. Violations will be fined." The sign was taped, not nailed. Amateurs, and the duct tape was already peeling off in the sun. My first thought was that it had to be a prank. Some kids messing around. But as I made my way up the drive, a stocky man in a tucked-in polo shirt flagged me down and handed me a packet. "Welcome to the community," he said, not a hint of irony on his face. "Karen asked me to drop this off. You've been brought into the HOA perimeter as per majority vote." Then he drove off in a golf cart that had the HOA logo slapped on the side, wheels squeaking all the way down my gravel path. I stood there holding 30 pages of rules about hedge height, paint color restrictions, and proper flagpole alignment. My cattle looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I tried calling the number on the back of the packet. It went straight to voicemail, then on the 4th try, connected me to a hold line playing flute music. 26 minutes later, a woman with a sweet but clearly fake voice answered. "Whispering Creek HOA, this is Janet. How can I assist?" I asked how a private organization could just claim my land. She told me I needed to direct that question to the compliance chair. I asked who that was. She replied, "Karen, of course." And just like that, I knew I was in a sitcom written by lunatic. 2 hours later, Karen herself arrived. She didn't knock. Just opened the gate that now sat in front of my front door, strutted across my porch like she was running for president, and began taking pictures of my property with her iPad. "You'll need to take down that windmill," she said without looking at me. "And these animals are zoned incorrectly. We'll issue a warning for now." I laughed out loud. Not sarcastically. Genuinely. I laughed like a man watching a raccoon try to drive a car. Then I asked her if she had a map. She said yes. I asked her to point to the part where my land was part of Whispering Creek. She tapped the tablet screen and showed me a map that had been drawn in Microsoft Paint. "This is the new community overlay," she said, like it meant something. Apparently, they had discovered a 40-year-old document that vaguely defined parcel boundaries, and a vote, one I obviously wasn't present for, was held to include adjacent land into HOA jurisdiction for uniform development. The vote passed 9-1. I asked who the one vote against was. She said it was hers, because she didn't think I'd cooperate. "But democracy wins," she added with a wink. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "Ma'am, this ain't democracy. This is trespassing." By the next day, they'd fenced off my entire southern pasture, the gate on my barn had a digital lock, and a pamphlet was taped to my chicken coop warning of noise violations. I wasn't just being absorbed, I was being invaded. I tried calling the sheriff, but he said it was a civil matter, and I'd need to get a court injunction. My lawyer, Uncle Pete, wasn't available until Monday. Karen, meanwhile, was already hosting a community tour on my land, smiling as she told residents that the ranch would soon be converted into a shared orchard space with dog walking zones. She waved her arms like she was auditioning for a home makeover show while standing in my hayfield. That's when I knew I had to stop playing defense. These people weren't going to listen to reason or wait for legal paperwork. They thought they had one because they drew lines on paper. But what they didn't know was that I had the original deed to this land, the mineral rights, and more importantly, ownership of the land their HOA office and half their homes sat on, held through a quiet trust my grandfather set up when he was still alive. They hadn't fenced off my ranch. They'd fenced themselves into a trap. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a fit. I just stood at the edge of their new fence, cows behind me, watching Karen explain future HOA pool plans to some poor couple who looked like they just wanted to walk their corgi. And then I smiled. Because this wasn't a battle anymore. This was chess. And I already had checkmate in my pocket. What they didn't know was that the land trust holding the legal titles had just transferred full control to me the day before I left for my trip. Karen might have claimed the fence line, but I owned the roots underneath her feet. And I was about to make her HOA regret every inch of galvanized steel they drove into my soil. The sun hadn't even hit its stride when I called Uncle Pete. He was the closest thing to a legal wrecking ball I had, and despite being semi-retired, the man lived for this kind of drama. He picked up on the second ring and grunted, "What did they do this time?" I didn't even have to explain. Everyone in town knew Whispering Creek HOA had been growing like a fungus, and Pete had been watching them with mild disgust for years. When I told him they'd fenced off the ranch and were claiming I was now under their jurisdiction, he didn't laugh like I expected. He just muttered, "Check the trust documents. Section 12C. I already had the folder out before he finished the sentence. Tucked away between dusty old deeds and water rights contracts was a clause I had never really paid attention to, probably because it was written in what could only be described as legal Morse code. But Pete walked me through it. Turns out, not only did the trust own my land, it also held options on several parcels that had since become part of Whispering Creek. Some were parks, some were greenbelts, and one was even the very lot their HOA office sat on. And the best part? Every lease was expiring in the next 90 days. I wasn't just a neighbor. I was their landlord, and they didn't even know it. That afternoon, I drove into town and pulled the latest satellite overlays. I traced every inch of land the trust covered and highlighted each parcel now occupied by HOA facilities. I made a copy for Uncle Pete, one for myself, and one I kept just in case I ever needed to hand-deliver a message to Karen. I didn't tell her yet. No, not yet. I wanted her to sink a little deeper into her illusion of control before I flipped the entire board over. Let her hang more signs. Let her send more warnings. Every step she took would only make her fall harder when it came time to pull the rug out. The next 2 days were a mix of passive aggression and thinly veiled threat. Karen sent her HOA security team, 2 teenagers with clipboards and cheap walkie-talkies, to do a compliance sweep of my ranch. I watched from my porch as they scribbled furiously on their checklists, peeking into my barn like they were inspecting a crime scene. One of them took pictures of my rooster. I yelled down to ask if they were measuring his tail feathers for height violations. They didn't respond, just radioed back to base. It was like watching children cosplay bureaucracy. Then came the flyers. Someone slid them into every mailbox in a 5-mile radius. Community upgrade plan. It read in bold red letters. It included renderings of a proposed HOA pool, a dog park, and a meditation gazebo, all marked for development on land that, according to their map, now belonged to Whispering Creek. Except that land was my southern field, my orchard grove, and the parcel holding the windmill pump system. Karen had even included a little note: land repurposing for community enrichment pending HOA Final Vote. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I took a drive out to the county assessor's office. The lady at the front desk raised an eyebrow when I asked for all the updated lease expiration notices on file for Whispering Creek properties. I showed her the trust ID number. Her eyes widened. "Oh," she said. "You're that guy." I just nodded. She printed out a stack of documents so thick it made my hands ache holding it. Every expiration, every parcel, every one of their little side projects that sat on borrowed ground, it was all in my name now. Back at the ranch, I hired a survey crew. Not one of those low-budget ones either. I brought in professionals who marked out the exact legal boundary lines with bright orange stakes, complete with GPS tags and laser-scanned topography map. The moment those orange flags started popping up around the HOA's prized flower beds and next to their office parking lot, panic began to spread. Karen sent an email blast claiming I was trying to sabotage community unity. She called an emergency board meeting and stood on a folding table in the clubhouse yelling about rural insurgents. One of the board members quit mid-meeting and walked out holding a "Free the Ranch" sign someone had made. I still didn't act. I waited. I watched. I let them paint themselves into a tighter corner. That weekend, I saw a new crew show up at my southern field. Karen was standing with them, wearing a hard hat and holding a blueprint. I pulled up in my truck, leaned out the window, and asked what they were doing on my property. She smiled like she was dealing with a misbehaving child and said, "Oh Wyatt, the community voted. We're breaking ground on the new HOA pool. It's already funded." I nodded, didn't argue, and just asked the contractor one simple question. "Did they show you the deed?" The foreman paused. Karen stepped in quickly, saying, "We don't need to show him anything. The land's within community bounds." I offered to show them the paperwork anyway. I opened my folder and handed it over. The man read through the first page and his face changed. "Ma'am," he said slowly, turning to Karen, "this says this land isn't owned by the HOA. It's owned by Wrangler Land Trust." She tried to wave it off. "That's outdated. Irrelevant." But I pointed to the date, updated and notarized just 4 weeks prior. The contractor packed up his crew and drove off, leaving Karen standing in a dirt field full of deflated dreams. Still, she didn't give up. She sent me another letter, this one printed on gold-trimmed paper, accusing me of violating HOA rules regarding land repurposing delays and community engagement. She said I had 10 days to comply. I framed the letter and hung it in my barn bathroom. By now I had dozens of these. Warnings, citations, compliance requests, all equally useless and laughably powerless. But the time to stay silent had ended. I walked the perimeter that night, checking every stake, every fence post, and every foot of land they'd tried to claim. I stared at their office building across the way and thought about what Pete told me. I had 90 days before the leases expired. But I didn't need to wait that long. I could act now. They built an empire on arrogance and bad paperwork. I owned the land under their feet. They'd played checkers. I'd been playing chess. Now it was time to make my move. The air was still when I made the first move. No press conference, no grandstanding. Just a quiet, calculated act that landed like a hammer on a porcelain plate. I sent out official notices, certified, notarized, and personally stamped, to every entity occupying trust-owned land within Whispering Creek. Every notice came with 2 lines that sealed their fate. First, effective immediately, all access rights are revoked. Second, eviction procedures begin in 7 days unless a lease renegotiation is submitted and approved by the landowner. Within 48 hours, Karen's phone must have caught fire because HOA members started showing up at my front gate in droves, all asking what was going on. Some were angry. Some were confused. Most had no clue that half their beloved neighborhood was built on land owned by a quiet cowboy with a long memory and sharper paperwork. I didn't speak to anyone at first. I let the panic grow organically. It wasn't revenge. It was revelation. They needed to see what happened when someone played power games without understanding who really owned the board. Meanwhile, Karen was silent, probably buried in meetings trying to figure out how this all happened. I imagined her poring over maps, documents, emails, trying to make sense of it. But the truth was simple. She got greedy. She tried to expand her little kingdom without checking who controlled the soil she was building it on. Then came the fencing. This time mine. My crew rolled in before sunrise with truckloads of industrial fencing, taller, stronger, and lined with camera sensors. Every parcel that belonged to the trust was sealed off within 3 days. The dog park? Locked. The meditation trail? Gone. The picnic tables and rose garden? Surrounded by 10-foot steel and a fresh layer of gravel. It wasn't vindictive. It was legal compliance. Every gate had a sign that read, "Private property, access by permit only." And not one permit had been issued. Karen tried to fight back with flair and theater. She called an emergency HOA Board meeting on the clubhouse lawn, but her usual crowd was already thinning. Word had spread, and reality had started to bite. Families who bought into the idea of serene community living were now finding out their HOA had overstepped by miles, possibly violating property laws. One couple stood next to the locked community garden with their toddler, reading the sign in stunned silence. Another man, a retired vet who used to jog the trail every morning, walked up to the gate and just shook his head before walking away. Nobody looked at me with anger anymore. Most looked embarrassed. Some even nodded in silent understanding when they passed me. Karen didn't take it as gracefully. She marched down to one of the new gates with a bolt cutter in hand and a small local news crew trailing behind her like puppies. I had already seen the broadcast plan for the evening. She was trying to spin the story. Her angle was that I was an unstable landowner illegally evicting peaceful residents. She wore a blazer over a neon pink shirt and had prepped her lines to sound both noble and oppressed. She stood in front of the gate and declared, "This is not who we are. This is not what community looks like. We will not be locked out by some cowboy dictator." Then she cut the chain with dramatic flair and stepped inside. She didn't make it 10 feet before my ranch hands, already briefed, approached and handed her a copy of the injunction. It was legal, enforceable, and backed by county sheriff's oversight. The camera caught her jaw locking tight and her smile vanishing. The reporter asked if she had a comment on the document. She had none. By the next morning, my mailbox was full. Not with threats or complaints, but with apology letters. HOA members were turning on Karen like a pack sensing weakness in their leader. People wrote things like, "We didn't know," and "She told us it was hers to use." Some even slipped gift cards and homemade cookies into the envelopes, as if goodwill could undo what had already been set in motion. I didn't hold grudges. But I also didn't backtrack. They weren't the enemy. They were just caught in the storm Karen brewed with her arrogance and her fake authority. At the HOA office, panic turned to chaos. Karen tried to call an emergency vote to reclassify the land boundaries, but it was too late. I owned the legal rights. Nothing they voted on had power anymore. The trust lease on their office building expired that week. I sent the final notice. Remove all belongings within 72 hours or be charged for cleanup. Her vice president, a mild-mannered guy named Dennis, called me directly. His voice cracked as he asked if there was anything they could do to keep the space. I told him he could apply for a new lease, but the terms would be drastically different. He agreed to send in the application within the hour. Karen showed up that afternoon, red-faced and steaming. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She just stood across from me at the gate, arms folded, nostrils flaring. I opened the gate and let her in, not because I had to, but because I wanted her to feel the difference between assumed power and real ownership. We walked to the old clubhouse, and I let her talk. She tried to shift blame to the board, to miscommunications, to outdated map. I listened, silent, then handed her a folder. Inside was the full list of every parcel, every lease, every contract. On top was a photo of her cutting my lock on the news, with the caption, "Trespassing violation pending." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just said, "You drew a line on a map. I built the land beneath it." That night, I walked the newly fenced property under a sky full of stars. The silence was different now. Not tense or angry. Just still. My ranch was my own again, and every gate, every post, every camera was a reminder of what happens when you fight arrogance with patience and facts. I didn't win because I shouted louder. I won because I knew the rules better. And now, for the first time in weeks, I could finally sleep without wondering what madness the morning would bring. It didn't take long after Karen's trespassing stunt for the Legal Avalanche to begin. Uncle Pete filed the first set of official complaints before the news segment had even cooled off. Trespassing, property damage, misuse of trust land, and unauthorized construction were only the start. By the end of the week, we'd stacked 6 separate filings, each backed with time-stamped video evidence, official land records, and sworn statements from contractors who'd been misled by Karen's fabricated land claims. The documents alone weighed more than a newborn calf, and we delivered them in a weatherproof binder directly to the county court. Karen may have thought the cameras were her stage, but now the courtroom was ours. And this wasn't a show, this was sentencing. The HOA Board began to implode under the weight of it all. Meetings turned into shouting matches. Emails leaked. One board member resigned live during a video call, slamming his laptop shut after screaming that he never wanted to be part of a cult. Another tried to quietly approach me at the diner, nervously sipping coffee while asking if there was any way to negotiate an early renewal of their facility lease. I told him the same thing I told Dennis: submit the application, accept the new terms, and stay far away from trespass lines. Fair warning was already given, and sympathy wasn't a renewable resource out here. Karen, however, clung to her fantasy like a dog with a bone. Even after getting removed from several HOA email threads and having her position challenged, she kept showing up to public spaces that were no longer HOA-controlled. She'd plant herself in a lawn chair next to the locked dog park gates and talk to whoever passed by, ranting about land tyrants and frontier fascism. I didn't need to say anything anymore. People were doing it for me. Neighbors who once nodded politely to her now crossed the street. The community garden lady, who used to support Karen's every initiative, walked up to her one morning and asked if she was aware she'd cost the HOA nearly half its operating budget in legal fees. Karen's smile cracked in real time. It was like watching a porcelain mask fall apart under pressure. The expiration of their lease on the HOA office arrived on a windy Tuesday. The building sat silent, its blinds drawn and lobby empty. I gave them the full 72 hours to vacate. No one showed up until the last morning. 3 of the remaining board members came with cardboard boxes and sad expressions, trying to gather years of paperwork, decorations, and outdated rulebook. I greeted them politely, even helped them carry out the heavier furniture. None of them mentioned Karen. Not once. She didn't come. Whether it was pride or shame, I didn't know. But I suspect she couldn't bear to watch her little empire collapse into a pile of bubble-wrapped chairs and fading flyers. By midday, the locks were changed. My crew removed the HOA sign from the building's front. In its place, we installed a wooden board that read, "Trust-owned property. Leased by approval only." I stood there a moment, watching as the last of the van drove off, the rear doors barely latched, one rogue yard sign sliding side to side with each bump. It felt like the final scene in a play where the villain exits not with a bang, but with an awkward silence and a broken prop. With the office gone, the HOA had to hold meetings in a rented rec center across town. Attendance dropped to single digit. The remaining members voted to revise their charter to include stricter legal checks before any land actions were taken. They also voted unanimously to never allow Karen back on the board. Meanwhile, I received no less than 6 new lease applications for community functions, some respectful, some almost pleading. I read each one carefully, rejecting a few, amending others, and approving one. I wasn't trying to destroy a community. I was just ensuring no one ever tried to steamroll my rights again. But I wasn't done. The most important clause had yet to be deployed. Wyatt's Clause, as Pete started calling it. A new legal stipulation added to every lease agreement. Any attempt by the HOA or its officers to claim jurisdiction, restrict access, or enforce rules on trust-owned land would result in automatic forfeiture of lease rights without refund. It was ironclad. No vote could override it. No charter could amend it. The moment they stepped out of line again, the deal would burn itself to the ground, and I'd be free to shut them out entirely. The final nail in the coffin came when I hosted a small, invitation-only gathering at the ranch. Just a cookout, nothing fancy. A few neighbors, some of the more reasonable HOA folks, a couple of county officials, and even a local news anchor who wanted a follow-up piece on the story. As the smoke from the grill curled into the air and laughter replaced tension, something shifted. People started seeing me not as the problem, but as the solution to one. Even those who had once backed Karen admitted they'd never truly understood how far she'd gone until it was too late. I wasn't some rogue rancher. I was the only person who had stood up and said no when everyone else was too polite to argue. Around sunset, I walked a few guests over to the new gate, one of the big ones, the kind with smart locks and cameras. On the wooden arch above, I had carved the name Boundary Line. Not out of spite, but as a reminder. Inside was my land, my history, and now my peace. Outside was whatever the world wanted to be. But the two would never blur again. One of the older neighbors, a man who had lived in Whispering Creek since it was just dirt and dreams, patted my shoulder and said, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad someone finally stood up to her." I nodded, thanked him, and watched as he left with a smile I hadn't seen in years. Karen, I later heard, had listed her house for sale under a private agency. No public listing, no open house. She didn't want questions. She wanted out. The house sold quietly within a week. No farewell party. No goodbye speech. Just a moving van one morning and a cold, empty driveway by evening. I never saw her again. But I kept the flyer she sent me, the gold-trimmed one that demanded I comply with HOA rules. I framed it and hung it on the wall next to the new office I'd set up in the old HOA building. Not as a trophy, but as a warning. Paper can build a lot of things. Rules, boundaries, illusions. But the ground tells the truth. And in the end, that's what held. A few weeks passed, and the dust finally started to settle. The fences stood firm, the orange survey stakes had been replaced by actual boundary posts, and the ranch returned to the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The sound of cows munching hay, the soft hum of the windmill, and the occasional distant bark from the neighbor's dog became the normal again. No HOA patrols, no unsolicited citations, no Karen. It was as if the land itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled relief. But just because the noise stopped didn't mean people stopped talking. In fact, the story of what happened spread faster than wildfire in a dry summer. It started with whispers at the feed store, then evolved into full-blown retellings at the diner. I'd sit down for a plate of eggs and hash, and within minutes, someone would bring it up. Some added details I didn't recognize, like a fictional duel between me and Karen in front of the community garden. Others claimed I'd installed an underground bunker or hired private security with drones. None of that was true, but I didn't correct them. If anything, I let the myth grow. Sometimes stories serve a purpose beyond facts. They send a message. And the message was clear. Don't mess with the cowboy who owns the land under your lawn chairs. One morning, a man approached me at the gas station. He wore a suit, which already made him look out of place, and carried a small briefcase that looked too clean to belong in our dusty town. He introduced himself as a producer working for a documentary company that focused on land disputes and modern-day David versus Goliath stories. He wanted to feature what he called the HOA Standoff. I nearly laughed. It wasn't a standoff, it was a slow collapse. But he insisted that people across the country were fascinated by homeowners associations pushing too far, and this story was cinematic gold. I told him I'd think about it, but deep down, I already knew I wasn't interested in making a circus out of what was, for me, a deeply personal ordeal. Not long after that, I started getting letters from other landowners. Some were local, others from different states entirely. They shared stories about similar overreaches. HOAs that fined them for growing vegetables, for parking tractors, for painting barns the wrong shade of red. Some asked for advice, some asked for legal help, and a few just wanted to say thank you for standing up and setting an example. I shared what I could. Uncle Pete even put together a short guide and posted it online. It wasn't legal advice, just basic steps on how to verify land ownership, challenge fake boundaries, and remind people that private property still means something. Despite all the chaos, the strangest part of it all was how much the town changed afterward. Without Karen's constant push to expand and control, people started talking to each other more. There were block parties again, casual barbecues, and even a community cleanup that wasn't organized through any HOA committee. Just neighbors helping neighbors. Dennis, the former vice president, started stopping by with homemade cornbread and quiet apologies. We never talked about the old HOA meetings. We just fed the cows and talked about rain forecasts. Sometimes peace comes not through battles, but by letting things grow back on their own. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A delivery truck rolled up my drive and dropped off a large, rectangular crate. No return address, just a simple label that read, "A token of appreciation." I opened it and found a wooden sign, carefully carved, polished, and sealed. It read, "Wyatt's Line, respect earned here." Below the text was a relief carving of the ranch, complete with tiny cows and fence lines. I didn't know who sent it, but I mounted it above the main gate. Everyone who came through noticed it, and they all asked the same thing. "What does it mean?" I'd smile and say, "It means the line doesn't move unless I say so." Word eventually reached the county planning office. The commissioner invited me to attend a panel on property rights and rural development. I declined the invitation, but Uncle Pete went in my place and gave them a polite verbal thrashing about the dangers of letting HOAs run unchecked. He returned with a grin and a free pen that said, "Property rights matter." I told him it looked like a giveaway from a tire shop. He said it was symbolic. I told him it was still ugly. We agreed to disagree. As the seasons turned, the last remnants of Karen's reign vanished. Her house was sold to a quiet couple who raised goats and didn't talk much. The HOA building she once called her empire was now a shared resource center, managed under strict lease terms and used by various community groups who had nothing to do with bureaucracy. The trails she once tried to patrol were now maintained by volunteers who didn't need uniforms or clipboards. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew the town had dodged a bullet, and I had been the one to throw it back before it hit. One evening, as I sat on my porch with a mug of black coffee and a straw hat pulled low over my eyes, I heard footsteps coming up the gravel path. It was Mr. Jennings, one of the oldest residents in the area. He walked slowly, but with purpose, and held a folded newspaper in his hand. Without a word, he handed it to me and pointed to the front page. The headline read, "Whispering Creek HOA officially dissolves after lease collapse and leadership resignations." Below it was a picture of the vacant lot where their sign used to be. I looked at it for a long moment, then handed it back. Mr. Jennings sat down beside me and said, "Never thought I'd live to see the day." I said, "Me neither." And then we just sat there, listening to the wind, the cows, and the quiet. I didn't win because I was richer, or louder, or meaner. I won because I knew where I stood, on land earned through generations, protected with purpose, and guarded not with arrogance but with principle. They thought they could take that with paperwork and fences, but I was raised to understand something they never did. You don't build a legacy on borrowed ground. And if you try to fence in a man who knows where his boundaries are, Don't be surprised when he locks the gate behind you.